My older brother turned my whole childhood into hell, bullied me nonstop, and talked our parents into thinking I was the bad kid for years. Then he got busted for fraud and our parents finally saw who he truly was and cut him off for good. Last month they died and left me the house, the business, and everything else he always thought was his. Now he's threatening to sue me and showing up at my door demanding his fair share. I thought I'd finally found peace, finally stepped out of his shadow. Then, Blake came back, not just to haunt me, but to take everything my parents left behind, everything I'd spent a lifetime being denied. You know, when I tell people about my older brother, how he made my childhood a living hell, they usually picture typical sibling stuff. A little teasing, maybe a squabble over a toy. But this wasn't that. Blake, he built his whole identity around making me feel worthless. I'm Ethan, 34 now, and for the first time, I finally understood what real peace felt like. That feeling? It's about to shatter. Blake's decided to crash back into my life. And this time, it's not just about a cruel joke or messing up a job interview. He's after everything. Growing up, Blake was the golden child. Charismatic, straight A's, that charming smile that everyone, especially Sarah and Michael, our parents, just fell for. To the world, he was polite, driven, perfect. But behind closed doors? That's where the real Blake emerged. He wasn't violent in the physical sense. His weapon was humiliation. Pure psychological warfare. He could twist anything, make me look like the liar, the attention seeker, the bad guy. I'd trip on a rug, and he'd convince Sarah and Michael I was faking an injury to avoid chores. Once, he broke a lamp, then calmly told them I threw a tantrum and smashed it myself. They believed him, no questions asked. I got grounded for 2 weeks. He just stood in the hallway, watching me, a wolfish grin on his face. It didn't help that I was quieter, more sensitive. I loved to draw. At dinner, I mostly kept to myself. I never begged for attention, never performed for relatives during holidays. Blake? He thrived on it. Jokes, stories, endless flattery. He was a master manipulator before he even hit puberty, and our parents completely ate it up. To them, I was the problem. The kid who needed to try harder, who was always sulking, who couldn't just let things go. Whenever I tried to explain what Blake was doing, Sarah would dismiss it with, "He's just teasing." And Michael would add, "You need to toughen up." Eventually, I just stopped trying to explain. I stopped expecting justice. By 15, Blake had most of the extended family convinced I was lazy, ungrateful, and impossible. My uncles would talk down to me at family barbecues, aunts would passively ask if I'd finally found something I was good at. Meanwhile, Blake was the high-achieving student with early college admission, an internship, and a girlfriend Sarah adored. I got used to being in the background, to the leftovers, to "Ethan, can you just do the chores?" while Blake got praised for washing a single dish once a week. What truly hurt was that he didn't just want to win, he wanted me to lose. A B on a test? He'd joke about how even the dumb kids in his class got A's. I'd start talking about a new hobby, and he'd chip away at it, making me doubt if I was any good. When I got into graphic design, he announced at dinner I was studying to draw cartoons for a living. My parents laughed. I didn't even bother to defend myself. College was my first real escape. I chose a university out of state, snagged a scholarship that covered most tuition. The day I left, Blake barely acknowledged me. Sarah hugged me like I was deploying. Michael gave me a weird half-nod, like he wasn't sure if he was proud or just confused I'd gotten in anywhere. I thought things would get better, and for a while, they did. I made real friends, people who liked me. I started freelancing, building a portfolio. I finally felt like I was worth something. But every holiday visit was a stark reminder. Blake had started working for Michael's company right after graduation. He called it leadership experience. I called it nepotism, but kept that to myself. When I visited, he'd talk loudly about business deals he'd closed or how some people just don't have the backbone for real work. One Christmas, he raised his glass, smirked, and toasted, "To Ethan, may your dream of designing comic book ads finally pay the rent." Everyone laughed, even Sarah, who chimed in, "Oh, come on, he's just kidding." But I wasn't a joke. I was slowly, painstakingly building something. By 28, I had my own business. Small, but steady. Mid-sized contracts. I didn't need to work for Michael. I didn't need Blake's approval. Yet, a part of me still yearned for them to see. To finally admit they'd been wrong about me, that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't the failure Blake had painted me to be. That never came. Not until Blake got arrested. It was around this time last year. My cousin, Alex, who worked at a midtown law office, called. "Ethan, did you hear about Blake?" My stomach dropped. I imagined an accident, something terrible. But no. Blake had been indicted for wire fraud. Skimming from vendors, creating fake shell companies, routing payments to siphon off thousands for 2 years. Michael's company was under investigation. So was Blake. This time, there was proof, emails, fake invoices, a paper trail. When I told Sarah and Michael, they refused to believe it. "There must be a mistake," Sarah kept saying. "Blake would never." But then the court documents arrived. The local news ran stories. Slowly, like a heavy fog finally lifting, they started to see. Not just what I'd always known, but the truth. Blake wasn't their hero. He was a master of masks, and his had just shattered. They were devastated. Michael aged 10 years in a month. Sarah stopped hosting Sunday dinners. And for the first time in my life, they turned to me. They asked questions. They listened. They started showing up for me, not just with words, but with actions. I helped Michael sort through the mess Blake left. I offered my design services to revamp the company's image. Slowly, the trust I'd craved my whole life began to build. Too little, perhaps, but not too late. When Sarah and Michael passed away a few months ago, weeks apart, both sudden heart attacks, the doctor said. Michael's was stress-induced, Sarah's was pure heartbreak. They left a will, clear and unambiguous. Everything, the house, the company, their savings, was left to me. Their final letter to me was short but powerful: "You've always been the steady one. We see that now. Take care of what we built. Forgive us for how long it took." Blake wasn't mentioned. And that's where the real story begins. Blake found out. And he is not taking it well. Not even a little. The first message came 2 weeks after the funeral. A single line: "We need to talk about what's mine." Then a voicemail: "You think this is over? Think again." Then he showed up, unannounced, pounding on my door like a debt collector. "I built that company too," he yelled. "Dad only cut me out because you poisoned him against me." He threatened to sue. Said I had no right to the house. Claimed the business was his birthright. I haven't responded. I've tried to stay calm, rational, but it's getting harder. Especially now that he's telling extended family I manipulated our parents in their final days, that I forged something, pressured them when they were sick. He's twisting the narrative again, just like he did when we were kids. Except this time, I'm not the quiet little brother anymore. And I'm not backing down. I didn't open the door the first time Blake came. Or the second. Or the third. I just stood behind it, still as stone, listening to the pounding, the yelling, the hollow threats he barked through the wood. My stomach churned with something I hadn't felt in years. A muscle memory fear, the kind you develop from a lifetime of walking on eggshells. I thought I was past all that, but his voice shot through the house like a flare, sending me straight back to being 14, cornered in the garage while he tore up my sketchbook and told me I was wasting my life. He came almost every day after the funeral. Sometimes early morning, sometimes late at night. Once, he stood outside for 3 hours, just pacing and muttering. I watched him through the blinds, wondering if I should call the police. Something held me back. Maybe guilt, maybe denial, maybe the part of me that still wanted to believe he'd come to apologize, that he'd changed, that our parents' deaths had shaken something loose, and this was just grief lashing out. But no, Blake wasn't grieving. He was scheming. About a week after the will was executed, a certified letter arrived from his lawyer. He was filing a claim to contest the estate, citing undue influence and emotional manipulation on my part. I laughed when I read it. A hollow, disbelieving sound. I'd barely spoken to our parents about the will before they passed. But that didn't matter. He was creating a narrative. And unfortunately, he was good at it. He'd been calling cousins, aunts, even family friends, telling them our parents had been confused near the end. That I'd isolated them. That I'd played the long game, using their guilt over the fraud to make myself look like the good son. Some believed him. Not all, but enough. Enough that I started getting cold texts, cancelled plans. One aunt sent a message, "If this is how you treat family, Ethan, I don't know who you are anymore." And that's when the floodgates opened. One morning, I found my car windshield smashed. A few days later, someone spray-painted "thief" across the front gate. I installed cameras. I filed police reports, but they didn't lead anywhere. No fingerprints, no witnesses, just long forms and shrugged shoulders. I knew it was Blake, but proving it? That was another story. The worst was a call from Eleanor, one of Sarah's old friends. A sweet, retired schoolteacher who used to send me birthday cards. She told me Blake had visited her, unannounced, asking if she'd sign an affidavit stating Sarah had expressed confusion about the will. Eleanor was horrified. She refused, but quietly, cautiously, she told me he'd already convinced at least 2 other people I hadn't spoken to in years, people who'd once sung his praises every Thanksgiving while I cleared dishes in silence. I was furious. Not just at Blake, but at myself for letting it get this far, for not fighting harder sooner, for still clinging to the fantasy that one day we'd be brothers again, even in some fragile, surface-level way, that maybe we could mourn together. I was mourning 2 parents and an entire childhood I'd never truly gotten to live. And he was out there rewriting history like it was just another business strategy. Then came the moment that broke me. It was a Saturday afternoon, warm and still. A rare, peaceful day where I finally felt like I could breathe. I was sorting through old photo albums in the living room, Sarah *********, handwriting on little notes, memories I hadn't seen in years. The doorbell rang. I considered ignoring it, but something told me this time was different. When I opened the door, there was no yelling, no pounding. Just Blake, standing in a tailored gray blazer, sunglasses perched, a manila envelope in his hand. "Ethan," he said coolly, "you've got 2 options. Either we split everything like grown-ups, or I ruin you." I stared at him. "You already tried." He chuckled. "No, that was just the preview." He handed me the envelope and walked away. Inside were printed copies of emails. Faked ones. Someone had created a fake Gmail account in Michael's name, writing messages that made it look like he'd been coerced into rewriting the will. References to pressure, regret, even an attached statement supposedly from Sarah, claiming deep concern about my influence. It was laughably bad. The grammar was off. The tone was nothing like them. But to someone who didn't know better, to a judge who never met my parents, it could plant enough doubt to throw everything into chaos. And that's exactly what Blake wanted. I sat on the couch for hours, the envelope on the table like a loaded weapon. I kept thinking back to all the times he'd lied and gotten away with it. All the times he'd smiled while I took the fall, the scraped knees, the lost scholarships, the quiet moments where I'd believed maybe I really was the problem. He'd stolen so many pieces of my life already. But this time he wanted to take the rest. The next day, I called a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, my lawyer. I'd never truly needed one before. But now, I was going to fight like my life depended on it, because in a way, it did. Over the next few weeks, things escalated. Blake filed a formal petition. His legal team submitted the fake emails as evidence. I had to sit through depositions, answer invasive questions, submit copies of my own communications. It was exhausting, dehumanizing. Every day felt like a battle in a war I never wanted. And through it all, he kept showing up. Sometimes at the courthouse, sometimes at the office Michael left me. He'd sit in the parking lot, staring at the front door. Once, I caught him talking to an employee, feeding them lies about how I cheated my way into the business. Another time, he showed up at a corner coffee shop where I was meeting a vendor and made a scene so loud, we both got kicked out. The worst part? A piece of me still wanted to believe he wasn't evil, that he was just broken, angry, hurt. That if I could just reach the core of him, the version of Blake that maybe existed once upon a time, I could stop all this. That hope died the day I found out what he did to Michael's former assistant, Brenda. Brenda had worked for my father for nearly 2 decades. She was loyal, kind, treated me like her own son when I was a teenager, cleaning out the supply closet for extra allowance. She testified in support of me, saying my parents had been of sound mind and fully intended to leave the estate as they did. A week later, someone broke into her car. They didn't take anything. Instead, they left a manila envelope on the seat full of screenshots of her son's social media, her home address, and a single typed line, "Perjury has consequences." She broke down, called me crying. That was when I knew Blake had crossed a line he couldn't come back from. I was done playing defense. I don't know if rock bottom is a sudden crash or a slow drowning. For me, it was both. A creeping realization that culminated the day I stared into the mirror, hollow eyes, dull skin from sleepless nights, and didn't recognize the man looking back. Not poetically, but truly, physically, I flinched. I looked like someone going through withdrawal. And in a way, I was withdrawing, from my family, from my past, from the illusion that being good and staying quiet would ever protect me. After Brenda's car was broken into and she called me sobbing, I hung up and sank to the floor of my hallway. Not the couch, not a chair, just the cold wood, my back against the wall. I stayed there for over an hour. No TV, no phone. Just silence. That tight, suffocating kind of silence where your thoughts loop like a bad song. Asterisk, how did it get this bad? How did he still have this much power over me? Asterisk, I felt guilty for Brenda, for my parents, for every person Blake was targeting because of me. I'd spent years swallowing my voice, trying to make peace, playing the bigger person like it was a moral badge of honor. But in doing so, I'd left people unprotected. People like Brenda, who didn't ask for this. People who trusted me. I thought about pulling out of the legal battle entirely. Letting Blake have whatever he wanted. Maybe if I just signed over the house or split the business, he'd stop. Maybe if I gave in, the harassment would vanish. The family members who stopped speaking to me might return. The whispers would cease. The tension in my neck would ease. I wouldn't have to be at war anymore. But then I remembered something from years ago. I was 17. Blake had borrowed my car, technically Michael's hand-me-down we shared, and crashed it into a tree while drunk. When our parents found out, he convinced them I had taken it without permission and tried to cover it up. I remember the look in Michael's eyes when he yelled at me. The disappointment, the fury. I remember sitting in the kitchen that night, Blake upstairs playing video games without a care, and thinking, is this how it's always going to be? That night, sitting on the hallway floor, I made a quiet decision. No. It wasn't going to be like this anymore. The next day, I fired my lawyer. Don't get me wrong, he was competent, professional. But he didn't believe in this case the way I needed someone to. To him, it was just another inheritance dispute, another messy family drama with gray areas and money on the line. I needed someone who saw what Blake was, who wasn't afraid to shine a light on it in court. Someone strategic, sharp, and most importantly, hungry. So, I started making calls. It took 3 weeks, dozens of consultations, and more money than I'd ever spent. But I finally found her. Her name was Chloe Vance. Within 5 minutes, I knew I was in the presence of someone who didn't just play the game, she designed the board. A former prosecutor, known for her tenacity in fraud and family litigation. She didn't blink at the fake emails. She didn't flinch at Blake's intimidation tactics. Instead, she leaned in, her gaze sharp, and said, "Let's bury him in truth." For the first time in months, something ignited inside me. Not anger, not fear. Resolve. The rebuild started slowly. I tightened up everything, my business, my schedule, my routines. I started therapy again, something I hadn't done in years. At first, I talked about Blake a lot. But after a few sessions, the focus shifted inward, to the childhood I tried so hard to forget. To the coping mechanisms I'd developed, staying quiet, avoiding conflict, minimizing my own achievements so I wouldn't trigger someone else's resentment. My therapist said something that stuck with me: "You've spent your whole life surviving your brother's presence. It's time to start building a life in his absence." That hit hard. Because even now, with him out of the house, out of the family, out of every rightful place he used to occupy, I was still living like he was in the next room. Every decision filtered through that fear. Asterisk, what if he finds a way to twist this? What if I make things worse? What if I win and it only escalates? Asterisk, but Chloe helped reframe that. "He's not fighting for justice," she said during one of our early strategy meetings. "He's fighting to keep the illusion alive that he's the one who matters most. The moment you stop playing in his shadow, you win." With her help, we began gathering everything. Not just defense, offense. Real bank statements. Video footage of him harassing me at the office. Security camera screenshots from Brenda S.'s neighborhood. Testimonies from former coworkers of Michael S. who saw Blake's shady deals before they unraveled. Piece by piece, we stitched together a timeline. Not just of fraud, but of manipulation. A life pattern. A character profile. Meanwhile, I made changes in my business. I promoted 2 longtime employees who'd stuck by me through the storm. I restructured departments, launched a new design campaign, even expanded into a small downtown space for client meetings. It was exhausting, but it gave me something to focus on, something real, something that was mine. I started sleeping better, eating again. I even began hosting small dinners at the house. Close friends, a few trusted colleagues. The house that had once felt haunted by the weight of my parents and their silence was beginning to feel like a home. I painted the walls, opened the windows, replaced old art with my own pieces, drawings I used to hide, now framed and proud. And the more I rebuilt, the more I realized something that shook me. I wasn't afraid of Blake anymore. Not really. I was angry and grief-stricken and occasionally overwhelmed. But the fear, that twitchy, bone-deep panic that used to paralyze me? It was gone. Because I'd already lived through the worst of it. I'd already survived a childhood of being invisible while someone else played the golden boy. I'd already spent years pretending I was okay while he chipped away at everything that made me me. And still, I'd made it. Not by playing his game, but by learning how to walk away from the table entirely. But just as I was finding my footing, Blake launched his next move. And it was the boldest yet. It started with a leak. An anonymous tip to a local reporter that my parents had been coerced by their estranged son into rewriting their will. The story ran in one of those clickbait online magazines, complete with stock photos of angry family members and a headline that might as well have been written by Blake himself: "Heir or thief, local man at center of family fortune feud." It included quotes from family sources and insiders, none of whom were named, of course, suggesting I had isolated our parents in their final days, convinced them to change their will when they were too weak to make decisions. It was full of holes, badly sourced, but it did damage. I lost 2 major clients that week. People started whispering again. One vendor canceled a deal, citing concerns about optics. That night, I went to the garden behind the house, Sarah's old sanctuary, and just sat on the bench with my head in my hands. I wanted to scream, to break something, to storm into Blake's house and drag him into the light for everyone to see. But I didn't. I just sat. Let it wash over me. Because I knew something Blake didn't. The truth, it doesn't move fast. It doesn't make headlines. But it builds quietly, steadily. And when it finally arrives, it doesn't knock. It breaks down the door. And we were almost there. It's a strange transformation, going from prey to planner. For most of my life, I was stuck in survival mode, reacting to Blake's schemes like a deer frozen by headlights. But by the time that hit piece came out, something had shifted inside me. I wasn't scared anymore. I was focused. Because Blake, in all his arrogance, had made one critical mistake: he'd overplayed his hand. And he did it in public. He thought the smear article would unravel me, make me retreat, force me to settle. What he didn't expect was for it to light a fire under me so hot I'd stop defending and start strategizing. Not just legally, but personally. I stopped thinking like the brother who wanted peace. I started thinking like the man who finally had something worth protecting, and nothing left to lose. The day after the article dropped, I met with Chloe in her office, which fittingly was on the top floor of a converted warehouse with glass walls and skyline views. She was already pacing when I arrived, binder in hand, highlighter tucked behind her ear. "He's getting desperate," she said without preamble. "This kind of PR play, it's noise. It tells me he's afraid he's losing." I sat across from her and said, "Then let's make him right." We spent the next few weeks creating what she called a counteroffensive. Not just legal rebuttals, but a full documentation package of who Blake really was. Chloe called it a character portfolio, and it included everything from his fraud indictment to statements from people he had intimidated or manipulated. Former employees, ex-girlfriends, a former therapist who couldn't reveal details but confirmed patterns of narcissistic behavior. But that wasn't enough. We needed to go deeper, stronger. And that meant doing something I never thought I'd do. I reached out to Michael's former business partner, Arthur. Arthur and my dad had co-founded the original company back in the late 80s. They split ways when I was a kid. Arthur retired early after a buyout, but Michael always spoke of him with respect. I hadn't seen the man in over a decade. He was in his 70s now, mostly off the grid in a coastal home 2 hours east. But when I called and told him what Blake was doing, how he was dragging our parents' names through the mud, he agreed to meet. Arthur had a memory like a steel trap. Over coffee in his sunroom, he recounted in vivid detail the early days of the company, the way Michael handled clients, and most importantly, how Blake had begun manipulating operations during his training years. He remembered catching him altering invoice data, remembered warning my father. "Your dad didn't want to believe it at the time," he said, staring into his mug. "But he knew. He just didn't want the shame of it to be real." Arthur agreed to write a formal statement, sworn, notarized. He even found old emails showing he'd flagged suspicious transactions, emails Michael had quietly acknowledged, then buried. It was heartbreaking, but it was also the kind of undeniable paper trail we needed. When I brought it back to Chloe, she flipped through it like a chef eyeing fresh ingredients. "This," she said, "is going to break his story in half." And it wasn't just Arthur. One by one, other people began stepping forward. Eleanor, Sarah's old friend, told us Blake had tried to bribe her for a statement. Brenda, Michael's longtime assistant, bravely submitted her affidavit even after the intimidation. Alex, my cousin, agreed to testify about the day he called to tell me Blake had been arrested, how I'd sounded stunned and shaken, not like someone plotting to seize an opportunity. Even some of my former high school teachers wrote letters. Apparently, Blake's manipulation wasn't limited to home. One teacher recalled how he plagiarized a class project and got away with it by shifting the blame onto another student. Another remembered how he bullied a quieter kid into withdrawing from student council, then took the position himself. All these stories. All these receipts. All these people who'd seen behind the curtain and finally felt safe enough to speak. Still, I knew legal ammo alone wouldn't stop Blake. Not completely. His real power came from perception. The way he bent reality to his advantage. And I needed to take that power away. So, I started working on something else, something that would hit him where it hurt most, his image. I hired a private investigator, not to stalk him or dig up tabloid dirt. I wanted facts, business records, property transactions, tax filings. Everything public, everything legal. I needed to know how he was funding this campaign of lies. How he still had enough money to throw around, hire lawyers, bribe relatives, orchestrate media spins. What we found was delicious. Blake had set up a series of shell companies in Delaware and Texas, LLCs with no employees, no public-facing business model. Several had quietly received consulting fees from vendors Michael's company had worked with in the past. In other words, he was still laundering money. Not on the same scale as before, but just enough to keep his lifestyle inflated. That gave us leverage. If he pushed too hard, we'd push back with IRS filings in hand. Meanwhile, I started reclaiming my family name in a quieter, more personal way. I hosted a memorial event at the neighborhood recreation center, one my parents had always supported through small donations, but never visited in person. I created a scholarship in their name for students pursuing small business development. I spoke at the event myself, even though public speaking used to make my knees shake, but this time I felt grounded, clear. I talked about Michael's discipline, Sarah's quiet kindness, and how they taught me, however late, that honesty matters more than legacy. That family isn't just blood. It's choice. Who you stand by. Who you protect. The response was overwhelming. Not just from strangers, but from family members who'd been sitting on the fence. My Uncle Raymond came up to me after the speech, tears in his eyes. I didn't know, he whispered. I didn't see what was really happening. I'm sorry. Bit by bit, the tide began to turn. My lawyer filed a countersuit against Blake for defamation, harassment, and emotional damages. The evidence package we submitted to the court was over 300 pages thick, documented, indexed, airtight. Chloe had it couriered directly to the judge with a formal motion to expedite discovery. But I wasn't done yet. There was one last piece of the puzzle, a ticking time bomb Blake didn't know I had. Months earlier, going through my parents' home office, I found an old external hard drive. It was in a drawer marked Dad Work Stuff, wedged between blueprints and old client contracts. I hadn't looked at it right away. Grief had made sorting through their things too painful. But something about that label had stuck. When I finally plugged it in, I discovered a folder labeled simply Contingency. Inside were audio recordings. Not many, just 3, but each one dated within the last 6 months of my parents' lives. They were conversations between Michael and Sarah, private, personal, and heartbreaking. In one, Michael said clearly, I want to make sure Ethan has everything. Blake's already had his share. He took it the day he betrayed us. In another, Sarah said, Ethan's always been the one who stays, the one who listens. I don't want him to think we didn't see him, Michael. We have to do this. And in the final recording, just weeks before they passed, Michael said, if Blake contests this, it only proves we made the right choice. I sat frozen at my desk, tears running down my face. Not just because I missed them, but because I'd finally heard it. Confirmation. They knew. They understood. They saw me. And now I had their voices to prove it. We submitted those recordings to the court under seal alongside a motion to authenticate their origin. It would take time, red tape, legal maneuvering, but they were real. They were my parents. And they were on my side. All that was left now was the confrontation. And believe me, it came. He showed up unannounced, just like he always did. But this time, I opened the door. It was early evening, just after a light rain. The air still smelled of wet pavement and pine needles, and the last sliver of orange sun dipped behind the trees bordering the property. I stood in the doorway with the same steadiness I'd once reserved for courtroom testimony. Inside, Chloe had just left. Our final prep session was done. The trial was scheduled to begin in 3 days. Blake looked the same, but smaller somehow. Not physically, though he had lost a bit of weight. It was in the eyes, the posture, the quiet panic that clung to him like static. He wasn't holding the usual arrogance when he said, "We need to talk." He looked like a man who just realized the check engine light he ignored was the last warning before the car gives out. I didn't invite him in. I didn't need to. He started talking before I could speak. "Ethan, listen. This doesn't have to go to court. I've been thinking about all this. Everything's just gotten so blown out of proportion. Let's just talk one-on-one. No lawyers, just brothers." "Now you want to be brothers?" I asked. Calm as ever. He gave a short, breathy laugh. "Come on. You and I both know Sarah and Michael weren't thinking clearly at the end. They weren't. They weren't all there." I held his gaze. "They were clear enough to leave you out of the will." His eyes narrowed. "Because you poisoned them against me." "No," I said. "Because you finally revealed who you've always been, and they couldn't ignore it anymore." There was a pause, a long one. I could see his jaw working, his breath catching. He wasn't used to silence. He was used to being able to talk circles around people, but I wasn't giving him that. He stepped forward just half a step, lowering his voice. "I will sue. You know that, right? If this goes to court, my lawyers are ready. I have statements. I have people on my side." I tilted my head slightly. "You mean the people you harassed? The ones you tried to bribe? Or the fake Gmail accounts you used to send evidence to the court?" His face twitched. "Because I have all of that on file. Admitted into evidence. Your shell companies, the fake consulting fees, even that tabloid article. You forgot to anonymize the email you used to pitch the story. You left a trail, Blake." He went quiet again. I could almost hear his thoughts racing, searching for cracks, for an angle, a loophole. "But here's the thing," I continued, voice low. "This isn't just about the will anymore. This is about character patterns, choices. You're not just trying to steal money, Blake. You're trying to rewrite the past. And I'm done letting you." He scoffed. "So what? You think you're going to win? You think the judge is going to just hand you everything because you played the sad little victim your whole life?" I didn't blink. "I'm not playing anything. I'm just showing the truth." And then I handed him the envelope. He hesitated before taking it. I watched him tear it open, brows furrowed, mouth twitching as he scanned the contents. Inside were 3 things. A formal cease and desist listing every documented instance of defamation, harassment, and legal intimidation, each backed with evidence and attached affidavit. A motion for an IRS audit request complete with highlighted documentation of the shell corporations and consulting payments he thought no one would find. A printed transcript of the audio recordings my parents left behind. Not the raw audio, I couldn't weaponize their voices like that. But the transcript alone, by the 3rd line, made his eyes widen. I have the originals, I said. Authenticated, admissible, and scheduled for submission the morning of the trial. He was silent for a long time. Then he looked up, his face pale. You planned all this, he whispered. I nodded. Of course I did. You taught me how. He opened his mouth. Maybe to yell, maybe to beg. But then shut it again. The air between us held heavy for a moment longer. Then, like a switch had been flipped, he turned on his heel and walked back to his car. He didn't slam the door this time. He didn't spin tires or yell curses from the window. He just drove away, a slow retreat down the winding driveway, swallowed up by the trees like he'd never been there at all. But that wasn't the end. Not yet. 3 days later, the court date arrived. Blake didn't show up. His lawyers did, barely organized, a mumbled mess. Chloe leaned over to me in the courtroom, whispering, "He's folding." They filed a motion to withdraw the contest. No explanation, no fight. The judge asked if we still wished to proceed with the defamation countersuit. I looked at Chloe. Then I looked around the courtroom at Brenda sitting quietly in the back row, at Arthur who'd made the trip just to be there. At the life I'd rebuilt, the business I protected, the legacy I'd earned. No, Your Honor, I said. We're satisfied. The estate was ruled uncontested. Everything remained in my name. A week later, I got a call from the IRS thanking me for the documentation. That same month, Blake quietly sold his car and his house. One of his shell companies shut down. Word spread. Investors pulled out. A second fraud investigation was opened. I didn't reach out. I didn't have to. The last I heard, he moved out of state, somewhere cold, isolated, a rental under someone else's name. I still think about him sometimes. Not with hatred, but with clarity. He spent his life building a house of mirrors, shiny on the outside, but empty and hollow behind every reflection. And when the truth finally broke through, there was nowhere left for him to hide. As for me, I still live in the house. The one my parents built. The one they left to me, not because I was perfect, but because I was real. I keep their letters in a drawer in my office. Their photos hang in the hallway. And every time I walk past the mirror now, I stop. I look, and I recognize the man looking back. Because I'm no longer the brother in the background. I'm the one who stayed, the one who stood up, the one who finally got to speak. And I made sure the whole world heard me. He spent his life trying to erase me. But in the end, I was the one who wrote the last chapter. What would you have done, knowing you had to fight not just for your inheritance, but for your entire past?